Why did it only take this to cause this? Because Marvel fans know their movies, and all it took were 3 words from Sam Wilson to cause theaters everywhere to erupt with the excitement that all the Avengers were coming back, even though that was never actually said. When we knew our Marvel history, one line like "on your left" communicated everything to us. This is similar to how the Gospels are communicating the identity to Jesus Christ. When somebody says the Gospel writers never claimed Jesus was God, they say this often because they are not familiar with the imagery in the Old Testament, such that when the Gospel writers link Jesus to Yahweh over and over again, they miss the signals or the callbacks that are being made. So I've put together a free resource with 10 callbacks from the Old Testament in the Gospel of Mark that demonstrate the identity of Jesus Christ to be none other than God himself. And I'll give you a brief summary of what those are. The opening citation in Mark's Gospel is a dual citation of Malachi 3 and Isaiah 40, both telling the readers that after the messenger comes, God's presence himself will visit Israel, and that's when Jesus shows up on the scene. Jesus then goes on to summon fishermen to himself, which is not a discipleship strategy, but it's actually a fulfillment of Jeremiah 16, where God promises that in order to start his second Exodus, when he's going to save Israel and the nations, he's going to do it by summoning fishermen to himself to tear down the tyrants that oppress his people. So that's exactly what Jesus does. When Jesus heals the paralytic and declares his sins forgiven, he's responding to the scribes who cite the Shema to him. Jesus doesn't object to this citation. In fact, he's demonstrating that he is the only God who both forgives sins and heals diseases, as Psalm 103 tells us. Jesus' disciples are accused of being unspiritual because they don't fast like John's or the Pharisees. Jesus makes the point that his disciples cannot fast because the bridegroom is with them. The bridegroom in the Old Testament, in Isaiah, in Hosea, is none other than God himself. Jesus is claiming to be Israel's bridegroom. When Jesus gets into a conflict over the Sabbath and whether or not his disciples can pluck grain, his response is not to examine Sabbath regulations, but to demonstrate that he has authority to determine what's allowed on the Sabbath. Namely, not because he's the high priest, but because he is Lord of this Sabbath, none other than God himself. When Jesus is accused of casting out demons by the power of Satan, he responds by demonstrating that Satan is actually the strong man. He has come to bind and plunder this man's goods. The strong man is none other than a reference to Isaiah, where God promises to liberate Israel from her strong captors. Jesus is doing what God said he would in binding Satan and liberating sinners. When Jesus calms the winds and the waves, this is a clear callback to all the times that God himself stirred, calmed, or separated the waters. You think of the creation. You think of Noah's flood. You think of the Red Sea Exodus. You think of the destruction of Sisera's armies. You think of Psalm 29 and the storm. You think of Psalm 107 and the deliverances at sea. When Jesus is depicted as calming the storm with his words, the disciples ask the question, who is it that even the wind and waves obey? And the entire Old Testament screams, it is God alone who commands the seas. In Mark chapter 6, we get a bread miracle. Just as Israel in the first Exodus ran into the wilderness and God fed them bread from heaven, so this Israel is now in a desolate place. And instead of Jesus calling down bread from heaven, he divides the bread himself from his hands to the peoples. Just as Yahweh fed Israel in the Old Testament, here God in flesh is feeding Israel from his own hands. In the next scene, Jesus is walking on water, and there's this strange comment about Jesus meaning to pass by his disciples. And if we don't know the Old Testament, it seems like a really arbitrary detail. But then we realize that that verb is the same verb used in the Greek Old Testament when God's glory passes by Moses and when God's glory passes by Elijah. Jesus is revealing his glory to his disciples, and then he utters 2 of God's most common identifiers in the Old Testament. He says, Ego eimi, I am, and then he says, do not be afraid. So Jesus, passing by the disciples, just as God did Moses and Elijah, then grants them comfort to know not that God is for them, but that he is with them. and that therefore they should not be afraid, just as God does in the Old Testament. And lastly, the scribes had no problem admitting that the Messiah would be David's son, but Jesus has a problem with them reducing the Messiah merely to an earthly son of David. So instead, he asks from Psalm 110, how can the Messiah be David's son if he's also David's Lord? The point that Jesus is making is that Psalm 110 demonstrates that the Messiah is not only a son of David, but is also David's Lord, in that the Messiah shares in the throne of God itself. That is, he cannot be reduced to only a human Messiah. He must be a Messiah who shares the authority and power and identity of God himself. And this is exactly how Hebrews 1 verse 8 interprets the Messiah. Namely, God says about the Son, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. So it's a free resource. It's in my profile, in my link tree. Jesus is God. It's a short resource so that you can get through it fairly quickly, but it's filled with support for everything that I've said here.